I learned that my mother had died from a Facebook post. Not from my sister, Grace. Not from my aunt, or my cousins, or any of the dozens of relatives who still lived within 20 miles of the house where I grew up. From a high school classmate I hadn't spoken to in 15 years who tagged me in a comment that said, "So sorry for your loss, Maggie." Maggie. No one had called me Maggie since I left. My name is Margaret Ann Hartley. I'm 44 years old. I've been a professor of medieval literature at a small liberal arts college in Oregon for the past 12 years. I have a husband, a daughter, a mortgage, and a life that has absolutely nothing to do with the town of Ash Creek, Pennsylvania. I left Ash Creek when I was 22, the day after I graduated from college. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. I packed my car, a 1998 Honda Civic with a broken radio, and I drove west, and I didn't look back. Not because I didn't love my mother. I did. But because my mother belonged to Grace, and Grace belonged to Ash Creek, and there was no room in that belonging for me. Grace is 4 years younger than me. She has our mother's honey blonde hair, our father's easy smile, and the kind of beauty that makes people stop you on the street to tell you that you look like someone famous. She was prom queen, valedictorian, and the lead in every school play from 3rd grade through senior year. She married her high school sweetheart, a quarterback named Travis, who now owns a chain of car dealerships. They have 3 perfect children, a perfect house, and a perfect life that they document on Instagram with perfect lighting and perfect captions. I was the other sister, the smart one, the difficult one, the one who read books at family dinners, who argued with our father about politics, who left. My mother, to her credit, never stopped loving me. We talked on the phone every Sunday. She sent me care packages for my birthday, hand-knitted scarves, homemade jam, newspaper clippings about people I'd known in high school. She came to visit twice, once for my wedding, once for my daughter's birth. She cried both times, and I cried too, and we never talked about why she couldn't stay longer. Grace, on the other hand, stopped talking to me the day I left. She didn't come to my wedding. She didn't send a gift when my daughter was born. She didn't acknowledge my existence, except in the passive-aggressive way of small-town families, by pretending I had never existed at all. I found out about the obituary 3 hours after the Facebook post. Grace had written it. Of course she had, and she had written me out of it. Doris Elaine Hartley, née Carpenter, 72, of Ash Creek, passed away peacefully at home on October 15th, surrounded by her loving family. She is survived by her devoted daughter, Grace Hartley Thompson, Travis, her beloved grandchildren, Emma, Jack, and Lucy, her sister, Beverly Carpenter, and many nieces and nephews. She was preceded in death by her husband, William Bill Hartley, and her parents, Margaret and Robert Carpenter. Not a word about me. I read it 3 times. The first time I felt nothing. The second time I felt a cold, creeping horror. The third time I felt the rage. Grace hadn't just forgotten to include me. She had actively erased me. She had written an obituary that listed my mother's parents, my grandparents, and my mother's sister, but not her own daughter. She had made it look like my mother had only one child. She had made it look like I had never been born. Part 2. The return. I flew to Pennsylvania the next day. My husband offered to come with me. I told him no. This was something I had to do alone. The flight was 3 hours. I spent it staring out the window, watching the landscape change from green to brown to the grey of late autumn in the Rust Belt. Ash Creek hadn't changed. It was still a town of 3,000 people, a single stoplight, and a main street lined with storefronts that had been empty since the mill closed in 1998. I rented a car at the regional airport, a Chevrolet sedan, beige, the most anonymous vehicle I could find. I drove past the high school, the church, the cemetery where my father was buried. I drove past the house where I grew up, a Victorian with a wraparound porch and a for sale sign in the front yard. Grace's house was on the other side of town, a McMansion on a hill overlooking the golf course. The driveway was full of cars. The funeral was tomorrow. I didn't go to Grace's house. I went to the funeral home instead. The director was a man named Mr. Henderson, who had known my family for 40 years. He looked at me with a mixture of recognition and discomfort. The prodigal daughter returned at last. "I'd like to see my mother," I said. He led me to the viewing room. My mother was in an open casket, dressed in the blue dress she'd worn to my wedding. She looked peaceful, younger than 72, her hair brushed and styled, her hands folded over a rosary. I stood there for a long time. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Mr. Henderson, I said, who arranged this? Your sister. Did my sister tell you that my mother had only one daughter? He hesitated. Mrs. Thompson provided the information for the obituary. I assumed it was accurate. Did you assume, or did you not want to ask questions? He didn't answer. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photograph. Me and my mother, taken at my daughter's 5th birthday party. We were both laughing, both wearing paper crowns, both covered in cake. That's my mother, I said. And that's me, I'm Margaret Ann Hartley. I'm her daughter, and I want the obituary corrected before the funeral tomorrow. Mr. Henderson nodded slowly. I'll do what I can. Thank you. I left the funeral home and drove to the only hotel in Ash Creek, a Best Western off the highway, the kind of place that smells like stale coffee and regret. I checked in under my maiden name. The clerk didn't recognize me. No one would. I sat on the edge of the bed and called Grace. She answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? Hi, Grace. A pause. Margaret? Mom's dead, and you didn't tell me. I posted it on Facebook. I don't have Facebook. That's not my problem. I closed my eyes. 22 years of silence, and this was how it broke. Not with tears, not with accusations, but with the same cold, clipped tone Grace had used since we were children. I'm in town, I said. I saw the obituary. Another pause. Yes? You erased me. I wrote an obituary for our mother. It was accurate. Accurate. Grace, I'm her daughter. I'm your sister. You listed Aunt Beverly, our mother's sister, but you didn't list me. You made it look like she had no other children. She didn't have any other children who mattered. I hung up. Part 3. The history. The funeral was at 11 the next morning. I arrived at 10:30, dressed in a black suit I'd bought at the airport, and stood in the back of the church where no one would see me. The church was full. Ash Creek was that kind of town. Everyone came to funerals, even for people they hadn't liked. My mother had been liked. She'd taught 2nd grade for 35 years, volunteered at the food bank, organised the church bazaar. Half the people in the pews had been her students. Grace sat in the front row, flanked by Travis and the children. She was wearing a black designer dress that probably cost more than my plane ticket. She was crying, not the loud, performative sobbing of the grieving, but the quiet, dignified tears of a woman who knows she's being watched. The priest gave a generic homily about a life well lived. A former student gave a tearful speech about how Mrs. Hartley had taught her to read. Aunt Beverly, my mother's sister, the one who had made the obituary while I hadn't, talked about what a wonderful mother Doris had been to her beautiful daughter, Grace. Not a word about me. The corrected obituary, I noticed, had not been printed. There were no programs with my name on them, no mention of a second daughter, no acknowledgement that my mother had any family beyond the perfect photogenic group in the front row. I stayed in the back. I didn't approach the casket. I didn't speak to anyone. I just watched, and I waited, and I planned. After the service, the family gathered at the cemetery for the burial. I stood under a bare oak tree 50 yards away, hidden in the shadows. Grace stood at the graveside, holding a single white rose. She looked beautiful. She always looked beautiful. When the last shovel of dirt had been thrown, when the last prayer had been said, when the last mourner had driven away, Grace looked up and saw me. Our eyes met across the graveyard. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just turned and walked to her car and drove away. Part 4. The Secret. I spent the next week in Ash Creek, staying at the Best Western, eating at the diner, walking the streets I'd walked as a child. I told myself I was staying for the funeral, for the closure, for the chance to say goodbye to my mother's house before Grace sold it. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that I was staying because I had decided that Grace was not going to win. I didn't know what winning meant yet. I didn't have a plan. But I had spent 22 years building a life in Oregon, a life of books and students and quiet, ordinary happiness. And I was not going to let my sister's petty cruelty drive me back across the country with my tail between my legs. So I started asking questions. The first person I talked to was old Mrs. Kowalski, who had lived next door to my parents for 50 years. She was 93, sharp as a razor, and profoundly unimpressed by Grace. "Your sister had that house sold before your mother was cold," she said, stirring her tea. "Listed it with a realtor the same day. Didn't even wait for the body to be taken away. I'm not surprised. Your mother would be heartbroken. My mother let it happen." Mrs. Kowalski looked at me with something like pity. "Your mother was afraid of her, Maggie. We all were. That girl has a mean streak a mile wide, and she's never been held accountable for anything in her life." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Kowalski set down her teacup. "You remember the fire?" I remembered. When I was 17, the barn on our property had burned down. The official cause was faulty wiring. But I remembered that Grace had been in the barn that afternoon, smoking cigarettes with her friends, and that she'd come back to the house with a strange, wild look in her eyes. "She told me once," Mrs. Kowalski said, "when she was drunk at a church picnic. She said she'd lit a cigarette, dropped it in the hay, and panicked, ran away and didn't tell anyone. By the time the fire department got there, the barn was gone. You never reported this? Who would I report it to? The police chief is her father-in-law. The mayor is her husband's business partner. Ash Creek belongs to Grace, Maggie. It always has." I thanked Mrs. Kowalski and left. I talked to more people over the next few days. A former classmate who'd been fired from Grace's husband's car dealership after refusing to falsify service records. A neighbour whose property line had been accidentally redrawn to give Grace an extra acre of land. A woman whose daughter had been bullied by Emma, Grace's oldest, and who had been too afraid of Travis's lawyers to do anything about it. I collected stories, dozens of them. Each one small, each one deniable, each one adding to the same picture. A woman who had spent her entire life taking whatever she wanted and destroying anyone who got in her way. But the most important story came from someone I least expected. Aunt Beverly. Part 5. The Will. Aunt Beverly called me on my 5th night in Ash Creek. She'd gotten my number from Mrs. Kowalski, and she sounded nervous. "Margaret, I need to tell you something about your mother's will." I sat down on the hotel bed. "What about it?" "Grace had your mother change it. A few months ago, before she got sick. She brought in a lawyer from out of town, not Mr. Henderson, someone else. And she had your mother sign a new will that leaves everything to Grace. The house, the savings, the life insurance, everything. That doesn't surprise me. But there's something else." Beverly's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your mother had a safe deposit box at the bank downtown. She told me about it years ago, said it was for emergencies. I asked Grace about it after the funeral, and she said there was no safe deposit box. But I know there was. I went with your mother to open it, back in 1995. Do you know what was in it?" "No. But your mother said it was important. She said it was the only thing she had that Grace couldn't take." I thanked Aunt Beverly and hung up. Then I drove to the bank. The branch manager was a woman named Carol, who had been 2 years ahead of me in high school. She remembered me, I'd tutored her in algebra, and she was willing to help. "The safe deposit box was closed 3 months ago," Carol said, pulling up the records. "Your sister provided the key and signed the closure form. Do you have a copy of the signature?" Carol hesitated. "I shouldn't—" "Please." She printed the form. The signature was Grace's, big, looping, confident, but the date was wrong. The box had been closed on October 10th, 5 days before my mother died. 5 days before my mother died, Grace had accessed her safe deposit box and removed everything inside. "She wasn't authorized to do that," I said. "My mother was still alive." "The box was in both their names," Carol said. "Joint access. Either of them could close it." I looked at the form. At the bottom, there was a notation. "Contents removed by lessee. Box empty." "What was in the box?" Carol shook her head. "I don't know. I wasn't there when they opened it. But the log shows that your sister brought a man with her, a lawyer, I think. He signed in as a guest. A lawyer from out of town. The same one who'd helped Grace change the will. I had a sudden, terrible feeling that I knew what had been in that safe deposit box. Part 6. The confrontation. I went to Grace's house that evening. I didn't call first. I just drove up the long driveway, parked behind her Mercedes and knocked on the front door. Travis answered. He looked at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered onto his lawn. Margaret, I need to talk to Grace. She's busy. Now, Travis. He stepped aside. I walked into the marble foyer, past the living room with its leather couches and mounted deer heads, into the kitchen where Grace was standing at the island, drinking a glass of white wine. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked annoyed, the way you look at a salesperson who won't take no for an answer. I want to know what was in the safe deposit box, I said. Grace took a sip of wine. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. The box at the bank. The one you closed 5 days before Mom died. The one you emptied with a lawyer from out of town. She set down her glass. Her face was calm, controlled, but I saw her knuckles whiten. That was a joint account. I had every right to access it. I didn't say you didn't. I asked what was in it. That's none of your business. It's my business if it was something that belonged to my mother, something she wanted me to have. Grace laughed, a short, sharp sound like a knife being unsheathed. Margaret, you left. You walked out of this family 22 years ago and never looked back. You didn't come home for Christmas. You didn't come home for Daddy's funeral. You didn't come home when Mum had her first stroke. You don't get to come home now, after she's dead, and pretend you care about what she wanted. I talked to her every Sunday. For 22 years, she came to my wedding. She came to see my daughter. She knitted scarves for my husband. I didn't leave her, Grace. I left you. The room went very quiet. You left because you were jealous, Grace said. You were always jealous. Jealous of my looks, my popularity, my life. You couldn't stand that Mom loved me more. Mom didn't love you more. She was just afraid of you. We all were. Grace's face flickered. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something behind the mask. Fear, guilt, something old and ugly that she'd been hiding for 30 years. I want the contents of that box, I said. Whatever they are. I want them back. You can't prove anything. I don't have to prove anything. I just have to make sure everyone in Ash Creek knows what you did. The barn, the property line, the falsified service records, Emma's bullying, the will you forced Mum to sign when she was too sick to fight back. You don't have any evidence. I have witnesses, a dozen of them. People who are tired of being afraid of you. People who are finally ready to talk. Grace picked up her wine glass. Her hand was shaking. Get out of my house, she said. Not until you tell me what was in the box. She looked at me for a long time, and then slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a key, a small brass key, old and tarnished. The box is empty, she said, but there's another one, a storage unit, on the outskirts of town. Mom rented it in 1995, the same year she opened the safe deposit box. She never told me about it. I found the lease after she died. She slid the key across the island. Go look, and then leave, and don't come back. I took the key. I looked at Grace, her perfect hair, her perfect dress, her perfect house, and I saw something I'd never seen before. I saw a woman who was terrified of being found out. Part 7. The storage unit. The storage unit was a small, concrete box in a row of identical concrete boxes behind a gas station on the edge of town. The lock was new. Grace had replaced it, I realized, but my key fit. I opened the door and turned on my phone's flashlight. The unit was filled with boxes, dozens of them stacked to the ceiling, labeled in my mother's neat handwriting, Maggie's report cards, Maggie's artwork, Maggie's letters, Maggie's baby clothes. I sank to my knees. For 3 hours, I went through every box. I found my first grade spelling test marked with a gold star. I found the watercolor I'd painted of our house, the one my mother had kept on the refrigerator for 10 years. I found every letter I'd ever written her, from summer camp, from college, from Oregon, all carefully preserved in acid-free folders. And at the bottom of the last box, wrapped in a faded baby blanket, I found a journal. My mother's journal. Written in her small, precise handwriting, starting in 1987, the year I was born, and ending in 2023, 3 months before she died. I sat down on the concrete floor and started to read. June 15th, 1991. Grace told another lie today. She told her teacher that Maggie pushed her off the swing. Maggie didn't. I was watching. But the teacher believed Grace. Everyone always believes Grace. I tried to defend Maggie, but Grace looked at me with those eyes, and I couldn't. I'm afraid of my own daughter. What kind of mother is afraid of her own daughter? March 3rd, 1995. I opened the storage unit today. I've started putting Maggie's things here, where Grace can't find them. Grace threw away Maggie's science fair trophy last week. She said it was an accident. It wasn't. I can't protect Maggie from her sister, but I can protect her memories. September 12th, 2001. Maggie left today. She didn't say goodbye. I don't blame her. This town, this family, we ate her alive. Grace is already pretending she never existed. I can't let that happen. I won't let that happen. I'll keep everything safe. Every drawing, every letter, every proof that she was here. May 22, 2023. I'm dying. I can feel it. Grace knows. She brought a lawyer today. Not my lawyer. Someone she hired. She wants me to change the will. She wants everything. I signed it. What else could I do? But I hid the storage unit lease. I hid the journal. I hid everything Grace doesn't know about. Maggie will find it. She'll come back. She has to come back. The last entry was dated October 10th, 2023, 5 days before she died. Grace found the keys. She took the safe deposit box. She knows about the storage unit, but she doesn't have the lease. She can't find it. I hid it in the lining of my blue dress, the one I wore to Maggie's wedding. When I die, they'll dress me in that dress. Maggie will know. Maggie will find it. The blue dress. The one my mother was wearing in the casket. I drove back to the funeral home. Mr. Henderson was still there, locking up for the night. He looked at my face and didn't ask questions. He led me to the preparation room, where my mother's body was still waiting for transport to the cemetery. I opened the casket. I reached under the collar of the blue dress and I felt the lining. There was a small tear, barely visible, and inside the tear, a folded piece of paper. The lease to the storage unit. Grace had taken everything else, but she hadn't thought to check the dress. Part 8. The Reckoning. I didn't go to the police. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't confront Grace again. Instead, I did something that felt both crueler and kinder. I went home to Oregon. I packed up my mother's journal, her letters, her photographs, all the evidence that I had existed, that I had been loved, that I had mattered. I showed them to my daughter, who was 12 and old enough to understand. I told her the story of her grandmother and her aunt and the town of Ash Creek, and then I wrote a book. It took me 2 years. I called it The Weight of Ashes, a memoir of sisters and silence. It was not a revenge book, not exactly. It was a book about memory, about erasure, about what it means to be written out of your own family's history. It was a book about my mother, her fear, her love, her small, desperate acts of preservation, and it was a book about Grace. I didn't name her. I called her Cordelia, after the sister in King Lear who was silenced and then avenged. But anyone who knew Ash Creek knew who I was talking about. The details were too specific. The story was too exact. The book was published by a small university press. It sold 5,000 copies. Not a bestseller, but enough. Enough to reach the people who mattered. A year after the book came out, I got a letter from Grace. It was handwritten, on creamy stationery, and it smelled like her perfume. Margaret, I read your book. I read every word. And I want you to know that you're wrong about almost everything. I didn't steal Mum's love. I didn't erase you from the family. You left. You chose to leave. You chose to build a life somewhere else and pretend we didn't exist. But you were right about one thing. I was afraid. I was afraid of you. You were so smart, so talented, so sure of yourself. You made me feel small. And I didn't know how to be small. I only knew how to be big, loud, in charge. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to believe me. But I'm sorry. Grace. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it, put it in the box with my mother's journal and didn't reply. Some hurts are too old for apologies. Some silences are too long for words. But I had my mother's memories. I had my daughter's understanding. I had a book that proved to anyone who cared to read it that I had been there, that I had been loved, that I had mattered. That was enough. That had to be enough.